Easy Explain the Philosophy of Margaret Cavendish, Atoms and Vacuum. This is essentially going to be a summary of Cavendishian space, her philosophical views on what space is, and this can be summed up as essentially Cavendish being anti-atomism. She's pretty openly against the idea of atomism, and she's also against the idea of there being a vacuum, that there's any kind of void in nature. And a place where she really sums this up well is actually at the end of chapter 31. She gives us 5 conclusions on why she thinks atomism just can't be real, can't be true. The first one is, whatsoever is body, or an atom, must have parts, so that body cannot be without parts. So again, going back to this idea that nature is infinitely divisible, beyond what a lot of the other scholars and thinkers at the time were considering to be atomic parts. The second point, there is no such thing as rest or stoppage in infinite matter, but there is self-motion in all parts of nature, although they are not all exteriorly, locally moving to our perception, for reason must not deny what our senses cannot comprehend. So again, we're going back to this idea of self-motion, that nothing stops moving, ever, nothing is ever at rest. Rest is simply just a form of motion, it's retentive motion, it's motion that is keeping the body in place. So even if you can't comprehend this, if you can reason it, it's maybe worthy of belief. Going to the third conclusion, without motion, parts could not alter their figures, neither would there be any variety in infinite nature. So here she's saying that, the theory behind atoms is that it's all random motion, but she's thinking that things move themselves, and that's what actually contributes to the variety we see in nature. She doesn't think that the variety we witness in nature would occur from just random motions. The fourth point, if there were any such thing as atoms and vacuum, there would be no conformity nor uniformity in nature. And Cavendish does believe that things can conform, things can be uniform. That does happen, we do observe that. And she thinks if we follow atomic theory to the T, or the idea that there's a vacuum out there, this just couldn't be. And finally, the fifth conclusion, there is a perpetual self-motion in nature in all her parts, so it is impossible that there can be perfect measures, constant figures, or single parts in nature. So again, this idea that almost we can't truly fully fathom how complex the perpetual self-motion in nature is, so we can't really figure it out exactly to get it down to these perfectly measured out units, or say that anything is in a constant figure or shape or part. It just doesn't work for Cavendish. Also in chapter 31, before we move on to some of her other conclusions about atomism and vacuum, does seem to be an apparent agreement she has with Leibniz and his philosophy. I'm saying it's an agreement because Cavendish was writing this in the late 1660s, and Leibniz didn't publish his monadology until 1714. But if you're unfamiliar with Leibniz's monadology, it's the basic idea, very generally, that monads are these simple units of life that are perfect and kind of contain an entire universe within themselves, and even to the bit there's a free will happening there too. So again, Cavendish doesn't know of this, but there's definitely some parallels that we see based on the couple of selections we have in chapter 31. So Cavendish says, wherefore the opinion of vacuum is, in my judgment, as absurd as the opinion of senseless and irrational atoms moving by chance. For it is more probable that atoms should have life and knowledge to move regularly. This is where we get this idea of monadology. Than that they should move regularly by chance and without life and knowledge. For there can be no regular motion without knowledge, sense, and reason. And this goes back to the last video we had about what knowledge and perception is for Cavendish, and how all matter is imbued with these mental principles of self-motion, sensitivity, and reason. And therefore, those that are for atoms had best to believe them to be self-moving, living, and knowing bodies, or else their opinion is very irrational. So she would agree with the reasons that Leibniz has for arguing for his monads, that they're, to an extent, alive, they move themselves, they have free will, and this is rational thought for Cavendish too. She also says, in alignment with the future Leibniz, the truth is every atom being single must be an absolute body by itself and have an absolute power and knowledge by which it become a kind of deity. And this is also kind of in alignment with Leibniz. So finally, moving to chapter 37, we see some more evidence of Cavendish speaking out against atomism and the idea of a void or vacuum. Finally, here she says, therefore, I am absolutely against the opinion of senseless and irrational atoms moving by chance. For if nature did consist of such atoms, there would be no certain kinds and species of creatures, nor no uniformity or order. So here she's really denouncing this idea that everything is atomic and moving by very random chance. She thinks that everything has self-motion, and that's what gives us the order and uniformity and all the varieties that we see in nature. She goes on, neither am I able to conceive how there could be a motion by chance or an irrational and senseless motion, no more than I conceive how motion can be without matter or body. Finally, for self-motion, as it is corporeal, so it is also sensitive and rational. Really tying it all back together here to denounce atomism and vacuum and support her theory of all matter being imbued with mind and everything moving itself. I hope this helps.